And it came to pass in the days of the judges that there was famine in the land of Judah. And Elimelech, a man of Bethlehem, his wife Naomi, and his 2 sons went to Moab to find sustenance. Elimelech died, and Naomi's sons took wives of the women of Moab. Their names were Orpah and Ruth. After 10 years, both sons died, leaving Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth as widows. It grieved Naomi greatly that the hand of the Lord had gone against her.
It's known as a weed of waste places, of abandoned fields. In my mind, that was the most powerful suggestion of time of drought and famine. Job mentions a scene of complete desolation, a scene of famine, a scene where weeds grow instead of barley and thistles instead of wheat. I chose to portray this thistle in its final form, which, when you look at it, is bleached white, and it seemed to me to be a much starker image in platinum than it would have been in silver.
The concern about famine is a pervasive human concern. It's a pervasive human concern to this day. It's a pervasive human concern in the Bible, in the world of antiquity generally, as well as in the Middle Ages. People live in fear of crops failing, of nature turning on them, and what can happen, the overthrow of society, the death that can come in the wake of famine. So famine being this perennial concern, and the fear of hunger generally, the fear of not having enough being such a concern, it sets the stage for the performance of chesed. So in terms of the dramatic arc of the story, famine, it's no surprise that famine would be the opening stark scene on which you could then put on this play, as it were.
The quality of the caper bush, its ability to thrive, find moisture in any crack, between the stones, its ability to force its way between the stones of building walls and force them apart. That's what enabled the rabbis of the Mishnah to call it the persevering among trees. Its flowers are beautiful. They're somewhat fantastical with white petals and brilliant magenta stamens. It blooms for several hours and the petals fall. It grows between rocks. It grows where there is virtually no moisture, but it survives.
There's a yearning in our electronic instant age for the method, for the beauty of these magnificent handcrafted manuscripts. And it's very rare to find, it's almost impossible, to find an artist who has managed to both employ the highest level of artistic decoration and technique from the medieval period and bring it together with a modern approach to how one views biblical books, books used in liturgical settings. The Book of Ruth, of course, having been read both as part of the Bible but also used for holidays, is one of the most beloved of Hebrew biblical books, and it's fantastic really to watch it being brought to life with these techniques.
Gold leaf comes supplied in what we call books. They're small packets of about 25 leaves with a piece of tissue paper in between each leaf. It looks as if there are solid pieces of gold attached to the page. Actually, it's an optical illusion, and the gold leaf that's used for gilding is incredibly thin. It's so thin that it's almost weightless. The sheet of gold leaf is so thin that if you took it in your hands and rubbed it, it would vanish. In order to hold on to that piece of gold leaf, enable it to be cut into shapes that I need to use to gild with, I place it on a gilder's pad. Once the gold leaf has been cut into shapes on the pad, you've got to get it from the pad to the gesso that's waiting for it. My preferred method is to use the very tip of my finger. The oils in my skin will hold the piece of leaf firmly in place, and it just hangs there as I transfer it from the pad to the gesso. Once the gold is firmly secured to the gesso, and once I have enough layers on so that I like the look of it, it has to be smooth, and that's called burnishing. And burnishing really is actually just smoothing and polishing it to a high shine. That's done with a tool called a burnisher, the tip of which is made of a hard stone. Shell gold is actually gold paint made out of pure gold. It's called shell gold because the method of storing it in the past was in a small shell as a droplet, either in a mussel shell or a small clam shell, and we still call it shell gold. The first step of making shell gold for me is to pour the gold powder into a mortar, add some honey and some coarse salt, like kosher salt, and perhaps just a drop of water, and with a muller, grind the two together so that they're thoroughly combined, and grind it until I feel it's going to be fine enough. At that point, it looks like mustard. You can't paint with the combination of honey, salt, and gold powder. It has to be prepared further, and the way to do that is to wash out the honey and the salt.
Upon hearing that the famine had abated in Judah, Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law set out to return to Judah. Naomi entreated Orpah and Ruth to stay in Moab. Orpah wept and kissed Naomi, and then returned to her mother's house. But Ruth embraced her mother-in-law, and said to her,
Ki el asher telchi elech, uva asher talini alin. Amech ami, ve Elohaich Elohai.
Wherever thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God shall be my God. And so they went until they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest.
As to the question of could 2 women walk around in the middle of nowhere on their own, is that a realistic situation? Well, it depends on when, because there were times when things were not as dangerous, when there was a central authority or not, and also in antiquity and in traditional cultures, very often there were very clear rules of the game. So, for example, even today, if you go to Bedouin cultures, a little girl can take out a group of sheep, out into the fields on her own, and she doesn't have to worry that somebody's going to do something bad to her, because everybody knows that, this is my land, this is my sheep, you don't dare touch my daughter, etc., etc. There was a very clear set of social norms.
2 women going from Moab to Bethlehem, this was not very safe. And we can see, for example, in the Song of Deborah, when she says that, caravans ceased. So not only that they had to use caravans to move from place to place, but the situation was not safe for individuals to wander around.
The story of Naomi and Ruth, in essence, takes place at the time of the grain harvest. Naomi and Ruth arrive at Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. The story continues through the barley harvest to the ripening and the harvesting of the wheat. The story concludes with securing the grain harvest for the community, for the year to come, and actually securing the future of Naomi and Ruth. Wheat and barley were the most important foods in the land of Israel and actually in the entire area. Barley, which ripens first, could be planted in areas where wheat could not be planted. It was salt tolerant. It could be planted on poorer soils.
The Israelites managed to settle the hill country because they adopted a certain practice that is known as terracing. It's very hard to cultivate the slopes of the hills, but the Israelites, who did not invent this particular method, but they adopted it, introduced this terracing idea into the hill country where they built their settlements, and that's what enabled them to really settle areas that previously were not settled. They created their own farm plots, and this enabled them to grow not just fruit trees, but even field crops.
Much of the action in the story of Ruth and Naomi revolves around the act of gleaning in the grain fields, gleaning first in the barley fields and then in the wheat fields. It was a tradition actually written as a law in Deuteronomy and written as a law in even earlier times, that grain that's fallen to the ground, stalks of grain, should not be picked up. They should not be tied into sheaves. They should be left after the sheaves are collected for the poor.
We can learn something from the way these laws are portrayed in the book of Ruth. I think that there is something to be learned because the book of Ruth portrays the application of these laws in what I think of as an idealized, perfect way. It all works the way it should. She goes to the field. She is welcomed. Yes, follow the harvesters. The master of the field tells the young men, don't bother her. That already is a red flag. That tells you that in the quote-unquote normal course of events, that may very well be what would happen, that you would have vulnerable people, particularly women, gleaning in the fields, and they would probably be harassed. But no, the book of Ruth makes it, it's all happening right.
I chose as an inspiration for this illumination a small limestone tablet known as the Gezer calendar. And on it are incised 7 lines of a poem or a set of instructions or a memory device for the agricultural seasons of the year and their activities. I chose for this illumination the 2 lines that deal with the grain harvest. 1 month of reaping barley and 1 month of harvesting wheat and measuring the grain. The text in my illumination is written as the calendar, as the Gezer calendar is, in Proto-Hebrew. I chose to gild it not with gold but with platinum as a contrast to the warm colors of the barley and wheat grains in the background. I also chose platinum because it doesn't tarnish.
The Gezer calendar gives us the order of the agricultural activities. Up until the discovery of the Gezer calendar, we had names of agricultural activities, but there was no real order to them. We could maybe figure it out, but I think that the Gezer calendar enables us to see what comes first, what follows, and how approximately long is a season of a particular activity.
She finds this older man, Boaz, who decides to take care of her, who's very generous to her, and Ruth, of course, brings everything back to Naomi. As Naomi sees her luck changing, it's not really luck, it's really the power of Ruth to inspire people, she begins to awaken. And when she discovers that, in fact, the person that where Ruth has found such concern is her cousin, in fact, the one who's one of the potential redeemers of the land and therefore of her dead son's seed, then suddenly she awakens. Then she becomes the wise old woman, very romantically inclined, telling Ruth exactly what to do in order to ensnare Boaz, we might say it, or to arouse Boaz, the old man, out of his certain slumber that he has, literally his slumber, but also his sort of lack of taking of initiative, and to get him to fall in love, to marry, and then ultimately to redeem the land and therefore to redeem Naomi.
Boaz in the story is the ultimate insider. He's a male, he's wealthy, he has a lot of people working for him, he has status in the community. And what's admirable about Boaz is that he uses his powers for good. He has a great deal of social and economic capital, and he uses it for good.
I think she's, in a sense, really sacrificing herself by going to this older man. And I've never been a great lover of Boaz. I think he's a good man. He does the right thing, and that's very nice. But I find him kind of dull. And he's gotten himself a pretty young wife who can have a child for him. Not bad.
At the close of the story, the townspeople wish that the child that may come of the union of Ruth and Boaz be like the house of Perez, Judah, and Tamar. And from that statement, I took the inspiration for this illumination. In the story of Judah and Tamar, Judah leaves his staff, his cord or his sash, and his seal as security for his promise. So I've linked the two stories by referring Boaz to the staff and seal of Judah. Traditionally, manuscript books are written by hand. The Hebrew is written in scribal ink, which is thicker, glossy, and reflects the quality of the Hebrew side of the page with its raised gilding.
I'll be using what's called a sofer ink, which is the ink that of the Jewish scribal tradition, which is usually used for writing the Torah scrolls and for mezuzot and for tefillin. And it's a different sort of ink than sumi ink or commercial ink, in the sense that it's a very viscous ink. It's a very thick ink, and it's a very shiny ink, and that gives a texture. Once it dries, it's almost like a three-dimensional texture, because it doesn't sink completely into the paper but actually sits on top of it when it dries, so it has this tactile sensation. Letters that come out of calligraphy are very different than the look that a font will give. First of all, they're written by hand by a human being, and that automatically puts a certain life force and, I'd say, differentiation between each of the letters. In a font, you'd get the same aleph, the same bet, the same A, the same B would be over and over and over again, even if the designer has put in a few alternate forms, but it's still a limited amount. In a hand piece of calligraphy, every aleph will be different. Every aleph will react differently to the letter that was written before it. And as I said, writing on parchment, every letter will be written slightly different depending on how that parchment is taking the ink. So when one looks at a piece of calligraphy, there's much more life in those letters. There's much more life in the text. So what you get in the end is something very unique, something that cannot be replicated. Even if I wanted to replicate it, I probably couldn't do it because it's something that is of the moment. And that creates something of everlasting value.
I tried to set this book of Ruth, which has an English translation on one side of the page and the Hebrew text of the story on the other, I tried to tell two parallel stories. On the Hebrew side, I used rabbinic commentary and midrash, commentary on the story itself, layers of commentary on particular aspects, on words, as my starting point for the illumination. By contrast, on the English side, I tried to give the reader a feeling for the time which is supposedly early Iron Age in the hill country of Israel.
Now, in general, let's describe the lifestyle, and which is primarily an agrarian lifestyle, which is described in the book of Ruth. It fits in perfectly with what we know of how people lived in small towns, villages in the Central Hills and the Judean Hills during early periods, such as the Iron Age.
On the English side, I've used illustrations of plants, animals, objects, the tools that the Iron Age community of Bethlehem would have used. The materials used for spinning wool into yarn. The forks and sieves used in preparing the grain. Drinking vessels, storage jars. Wine cups with a beer jug. The child Obed is symbolized with a string of eye beads, an amulet for his life and safety.
We actually know quite a lot about what people ate, how they cooked, the importance of food in the biblical period, and we have evidence of the types of cooking pots, the type of serving vessels, the actual components of their diet, and we can see this both from texts that describe this, from artistic depictions of the foodstuff and the agriculture, but from the archaeological remains. And we have the tools, the vessels, the cooking vessels. It's portrayed that the Moabites and the Judites are very close, and this is something that we have good indication of also from an archaeological and from an epigraphic point of view. If we're talking about what's going on today is very simply, it's the after 100 years of which the colonial powers tried to enforce nation states onto the Middle East, all that's collapsing, and they're reverting to tribes, clans, religious groupings back to where, that like they've done since the beginning of time. So I think the same thing goes for earlier periods as well.
The story has reached the end of the grain harvest. The wheat has been harvested. It will be threshed at nightfall at the threshing floor. This puts Naomi and Ruth back into the same desperate situation that they were in when they arrived. There will be no more gleaning in the wheat fields. How will they support themselves? It's a really desperate moment, and Naomi hatches a desperate plan, a plan that's really fraught with extreme danger for both of them. But nevertheless, Naomi goes ahead and says to Ruth, "Bathe, anoint yourself with perfume, dress festively, and go to the threshing floor." The suggestion here is one of seduction.
And so, while Naomi is the one trying to tell Ruth what to do, it's really Ruth who's the one who has a greater strength than Naomi, the one who tells Naomi, don't give up, and the one who says to Boaz, you're not an old man, you can act as God does. And therefore, in a story in which God barely acts, right? only in the background bringing fertility and bringing Ruth to end up in Boaz's field, but really it's Ruth who activates human beings. And she activates human beings not in a magical way. She activates human beings because she herself is so amazing. It's really the power of a paradigm. It's the power of a person who models an incredible behavior and then says you can be part of it as well. You too can have your part in the redemptive process. In Barbara's beautiful illustrations of the threshing floor, she uses a midrash that identifies that threshing floor with the same threshing floor that David bought and ultimately became the place of the temple. And I think one of the interesting things to reflect on is the way in which the place of illicit sexual contact between Ruth and Boaz, so illicit that Ruth has to sneak out of the threshing floor and the barn before daybreak so that nobody sees her, that becomes identified with the place of the sacred.
The threshing floor was generally constructed on a high place outside of the town, where the prevailing and constant wind could be used in order to separate the grain from the stalks. The sheaves of grain were unbound. Then an agricultural tool called a threshing sledge was drawn across it, usually by an ox or a donkey, which would crush the grain stalks and separate the ears of grain from them.
The threshing sledge was another one of those implements that used flint. On the bottom of the sledge, flint was embedded. The sledge itself was made out of wood, so it was easy to embed flint blades in the bottom of the sledge.
The vision of a threshing floor as the site of a temple led me to Maimonides' manuscript of the Mishnah, where he took the biblical description of the architecture of the temple and drew an outline of what he felt would have been the temple floor. The background here is shell gold, but in this case I burnished it so that it has not a high polish, but a sheen. And onto it, I painted Maimonides' diagram in red, blue, and purple. The image of God's wing as a metaphor for protection, for shelter, appears often in biblical literature. And in the story of Ruth, Boaz asks God for protection for Ruth, since she has come to find shelter under his wings. The word for wing in Hebrew, kanaf, also has other meanings. It can also mean the edge or the corner of a garment. So in the story of Ruth, Ruth asks Boaz to spread his wing over her. And the rabbinic commentary over centuries has differed in its analysis of what actually has taken place at night on the threshing floor. I chose the literal definition, kanaf, wing, to illuminate this part of the story and let the viewer find his own explanation. Protection, shelter, corner of the garment, whichever the viewer can choose.
But she goes in the middle of the night, lies at the feet of this man that she doesn't know. He could push her away. He could treat her like a prostitute. Or he could ignore her. He could do all sorts. Or he could rape her. He could do all sorts of things. But she takes her life at risk, as Esther did, and in that sense saves the Jewish people by being the progenitor of King David and then the Messiah.
That is, she doesn't do what Naomi tells her to do, which is just be quiet and let the man, hopefully sexually aroused, do what men do. That's not at all Ruth's approach. After she's aroused, literally Boaz, then she turns to Boaz and she gives him a moral talking to, and says, you be the Redeemer. You spread out your garb, your mantle over me as a protective wing, just as, and here Ruth's rhetoric is to repeat words that Boaz once said, but to turn them around. And Boaz takes up that duty. If we remember for a moment when Ruth first comes to the field, and she's identified to Boaz as that Moabite woman who came back with Naomi, then he turns to Ruth and he says, you're an amazing woman, Ruth. I can't believe you. You, just like Abraham, you left your father and mother's home, you left your homeland, and you came to follow a vision, came to follow and come to our people. And I'm so amazed, he says, at your chesed, at your kindness, at your loyalty. Chesed can mean very much loyalty. Your loyalty to your mother-in-law, your loyalty to your dead husband. And may God bless you by God spreading his wing over you.
Boaz instructs Ruth to remain until morning. And the text says, and she rose up before one could discern another. So I chose to picture that moment when there's just enough light to see your way on a path, but not enough light for anyone to recognize someone.
But the interesting thing is that Boaz was very concerned about her reputation. And so he wanted to make sure that when she leaves, no one sees her, so no one can later attack her or him.
It's the time before the monarchies were formed, before the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. And it's looked upon a time where each group set its own rules.
We don't see that at all. We see a sense of responsibility, social responsibility. We see adherence to the law of gleanings, not just in the sense of the law being observed, but with the spirit of the law, the sense of kindness also being observed. We see the law of the Goel being observed. We see the city elders behaving in a proper manner. So it is an interesting contrast that I think is eye-catching.
If we're talking about the time of the judges, there aren't cities then. For example, the depiction of Bethlehem as a site with a village gate, it's probably not a city gate as we know from large Israelite cities at later periods of the Iron Age. On the other hand, perhaps that's an indication that the setting of the story is, even though they're trying to harken back to the time of the judges, they're actually placing it in the realia of a later period when there were cities, when there are city gates, when the elders did gather in the courtyard in front of the city gate, and all the civic activities occurred there.
The union of Ruth and Boaz is symbolized here by a wedding belt. Ruth's ornate sash is based on the festive clothing of Yemenite and Bedouin women, both ancient and modern. Here, their wedding belts are usually decorated with silver ornaments and many tinkling bells. I've chosen to use silver rather than gold leaf for this illumination because silver has a lovely glowing white quality to it.
Archaeologically, we really don't know a lot about the ceremony. There are some documents from various cultures in the ancient Near East which tell us a little about how marriage was conducted, but there really is very, very little evidence of how it actually was conducted. Marriage in all ancient and traditional societies was first and foremost connected to the needs of the lineage and much less connected to whether I fell in love with this young man and I'm going to marry him. And if anything, in traditional societies, if a young couple dared do that, they very often suffered dire circumstances because that's not what we want. And it's the lineage who talks and not your personal whims.
Gesso is a material that's made of a combination of plaster, white lead, some sort of glue, a little bit of sugar, and some bowl. Some materials are added to the mixture to help the illuminator create this highly polished surface on the gold. Some materials are added to the mixture as a glue, because that's actually what holds the gold leaf in place. After I paint the gesso into the areas that I wish to gild, I need to let it dry thoroughly. I go over it with a fine blade or even some sandpaper to even the surface, to scrape off any little bumps and marks that I may have left. I have to be certain that this surface is as smooth and as perfect as I can get it, because what you have on the gesso surface is what you're going to see when it's gilded and polished. In order to glue the leaf to the gesso surface, I have to activate the glue that's in the mixture. I use a small tube made of a rolled up piece of paper to direct my breath exactly to the area that needs to be moistened. At that point, I have about 3 seconds to pick up a small piece of leaf and drop it onto the surface, press it down, and burnish it slightly.
When we talk about decorated Hebrew manuscripts, they could be decorated with simple floral or geometric motifs. They could be illustrated, meaning that a particular scene from the book, from the text, is illustrated, or a term that we sometimes use is illuminated. Illuminated is used when the artist employs gold or silver leaf, and the reason that this word is used is because when light shines off the page is actually illuminated. It comes to light, it shines brightly. So this form of manuscript decoration, where gold and silver leaf is used, is termed an illuminated Hebrew manuscript.
In the Israel Museum, there's a set of children's toys from early Iron Age. There's a wonderful bear, pull toy, and an otter. I was inspired by that to have a pull toy symbolize the child Obed. And I found what I thought was absolutely the most charming of all, a bird with a ram's head.
Now we have a son, and it's Boaz's son, and it's Naomi's son, which carries the name of Naomi's original son, but Boaz and Naomi are now caring for this son, and we don't hear much about Ruth after that. And I feel kind of sorry for Ruth, and I think, did she make the right decision? I guess she did in terms of Jewish history, but whatever happens to Ruth later, does she have more children and then they become her children and we don't hear much about them? What happens to Ruth? I don't know. The story leaves us hanging.
From the most ancient times, the myrtle has been a symbol of vitality, of strength, of the continuity of life for ancient Near Eastern peoples, and up into the present, it still is. The final name in the genealogy is David, revered king of Israel.
And by attaching this final verse showing that David's genealogy goes back to Judah, the son of Jacob, and then all the way to David, it connects the period of the judges with the period of the monarchy and puts David in the chronological position, and that's why the order of the book in the Christian tradition is between Judges and Samuel.
I've always felt that the book of Ruth was unique among all the Bible stories as the most beautiful example of a story told from a woman's perspective. And it occurred to me that as the creator of this manuscript, I could continue it with a celebration of the women who made the story possible. It's the custom in some Jewish communities to recite the last verses of Proverbs, and it's known as Eshet Chayil, a woman of valor. The 16th century rabbis of Safad began this custom. They chose a woman of wisdom, of courage, for each line of the text of Eshet Chayil. So this book of Ruth ends with the name of 27 women of valor.
And each of these women, from the women in Egypt who saved the Israelite children, to Rachel and Leah, to Sarah, who comes before Rachel and Leah, who knows that her son Isaac is going to carry the line, and she will do what she has to do in order for Isaac to carry that line, to Rebecca, who knows that her son Jacob will carry the line and tricks her husband so that her son will carry the line, to Rachel and Leah, who conspire together, even though they fight a lot, because they will carry the line, on and on to Esther, puts her life at stake in order to save her people, and to Ruth, who follows her mother-in-law into a strange land, who is willing to go in the middle of the night to lie at the feet of an older man whom she doesn't know, who could do anything to her, because on some level she knows that this is something that she has to do, that some level all of these women know that they will carry the line, and that line cannot be carried without the women of the Bible. So I think feminists have come to realize this these days and recognize this, and therefore are seeking out the stories of each of these women to the great benefit of the Jewish people and civilization as a whole.